Empires are often remembered for their armies, great monuments, powerful leaders, but those things cost money, and money does not appear on its own. Behind every powerful state in history there was a system quietly at work, a system that collected revenue from land, from trade, from people. That system was not always visible. It did not make for dramatic stories, but it was almost always what made everything else possible. The army needed paying, the roads needed building. The officials needed salaries. All of that required a reliable flow of income. The states that figured out how to build that flow consistently over long periods were the ones that lasted. Military victories come and go. Territory changes hands. Leaders rise and fall. But a well-organized system for collecting revenue keeps working through all of that. It is one of the quietest foundations of political power, and it is one of the most consequential. What made some states durable and others not was rarely just about who had the strongest army. It was often about who had the most organized system for generating income, who could pay their soldiers reliably, who could maintain roads, ports, and administrative networks over decades, who had the institutional machinery to keep turning land and trade into government revenue. That is what this video is about. How did the most powerful states in history actually build a reliable income, and what did that machinery make possible? The earliest large states faced an obvious problem. They controlled enormous territories. They needed to fund armies, build infrastructure, and pay administrators. But those territories were vast and difficult to monitor. How do you collect revenue from thousands of farmers and merchants spread across hundreds of miles? The earliest and simplest answer was tribute. The conquered people paid a regular sum to the ruling power, in grain, in silver, in goods, or in labor. This was straightforward, but it was also fragile. Tribute depended on compliance. When the relationship weakened, the payments often stopped. The Persian Empire developed something more organized. It divided its territories into administrative regions called satrapies. Each satrapy had a governor, a satrap, responsible for collecting tribute and sending it to the central treasury at Persepolis. The amounts were set in advance. Records were kept. This was an early version of what we would recognize as a fiscal administration system. It was not perfect, but it was more reliable than a simple tribute. China's imperial dynasties approached the same problem through land taxation. Farming was the foundation of the economy. If you tax the harvest, you tax the wealth of the realm. The Tang dynasty in the 7th and 8th centuries developed a particularly systematic approach. It recorded land holdings across the empire, assigned tax quotas to regions, and collected grain, cloth, and labor service from farming households. The system required surveys, records, and trained administrators. It was slow and complicated to run, but it generated steady revenue over long periods. Rome developed something different again. The Roman census was a regular, systematic count of people and property. It was not just a population survey. It was the foundation of the entire tax system. Officials recorded who owned what, how much land they had, and how much revenue that land was expected to produce. That information determined how much each person owed. Building that system required a trained administrative class. It required roads for travel and communication. It required record storage and regular updating. It was an investment, but it gave Roman governments a fiscal capacity that very few states had previously achieved. These early systems shared one key characteristic. They all required the state to invest in knowledge, knowing who lived in the territory, what they owned, and what they owed. That investment in administrative knowledge was in many ways the real foundation of state revenue capacity. Without it, governments were essentially guessing. With it, they could plan. Roman provincial taxation is one of the best documented revenue systems from the ancient world. And it shows clearly how an organized fiscal system creates institutional power beyond just the money it collects. The Roman state collected taxes from its provinces in several ways. There was a tax on land and property, the tributum soli. There was a poll tax on individuals, the tributum capitis. There were customs duties, the portoria, collected at ports and road crossings, and there were taxes on inheritances and certain transactions. Each of these required different administrative structures. Customs duties needed officials at border points. Land taxes needed property records. Poll taxes needed population registers. In the Republican period, Rome often outsourced this work. Private contractors called publicani bid for the right to collect taxes in particular regions. They paid the Roman treasury an upfront sum. Then they collected taxes from the local population and kept whatever they collected above that sum. This gave the state immediate cash, but it created a gap. The Publicani had every incentive to collect as much as possible. The state had limited visibility into what was actually happening on the ground. As the empire grew and matured, this system gradually shifted. Imperial administrations built more direct collection structures. They stationed their own officials in the provinces. They conducted their own surveys and maintained their own records. The result was a slower but more predictable flow of revenue. It also gave the central government much better information about the economic conditions of its territories. This is the less discussed power of a strong revenue system. It generates information. Tax records are surveys of economic activity. Property registers are maps of wealth. Population counts are pictures of human settlement. A state that collects this information regularly develops a detailed understanding of what it governs. That understanding is itself a form of power. The Ottoman Empire developed a different institutional solution to the same challenge. The empire was vast. Building a direct central collection system everywhere would have been expensive and slow. So the Ottomans used a practice called tax farming. A private individual, called a multezim, would bid for the right to collect taxes in a specific area for a fixed period. The state received an upfront payment. The tax farmer then collected revenue and kept the surplus. This had real advantages. It required less central bureaucracy. It gave the state immediate cash, and it transferred the risk of poor harvests or economic disruption to the private collector. But it also had structural costs. Tax farmers had strong incentives to collect as much as possible during their contract period. They had much less incentive to invest in the long-term economic health of the region they were taxing. The Ottoman state understood this tension. Running alongside the tax farming system was a separate arrangement called the timur system. Under this arrangement, land revenue was assigned directly to military officials in exchange for military service. There was no private intermediary. The official who benefited from the land was also the one obligated to contribute to the state's defense. It was a direct institutional link between land revenue and military capacity. Early modern European states faced similar challenges and developed their own fiscal solutions. In France, the crown relied on a patchwork of different taxes: the taille on land, the gabelle on salt, customs duties, and income from royal lands. These were collected through a mixture of royal officials and private contractors. The system was complicated and uneven. Revenue was often hard to predict. This created persistent pressure on the royal finances. In England, a different path emerged after the political upheavals of the 17th century. Parliament took on a central role in approving taxation. A professional customs and excise administration was built, one of the largest government bureaucracies in the country at the time. The government began issuing long-term public debt backed by future tax revenues. This allowed the state to spend more in the short term without waiting for immediate income. The system required confidence. Investors had to believe the government would repay its debts. That confidence was sustained by parliamentary oversight and by the proven reliability of customs and excise revenue over time. The result was one of the most powerful fiscal systems in European history. It did not produce results overnight. It took decades to build. But once built, it gave the English state a financial capacity that most of its rivals could not match. Looking across these examples, certain patterns emerge. They appear in very different settings across long stretches of history. The first is the relationship between revenue collection and bureaucratic capacity. States that built strong revenue systems also built strong administrative systems. The two developed together. A census requires trained administrators. A customs network requires officials at every port. A land tax requires surveyors and record keepers. The bureaucratic infrastructure built for revenue collection becomes the infrastructure for governing everything else. Information flows through it. Officials develop local knowledge. Communication networks form around it. Revenue administration and state administration grow together. The second pattern is the tension between delegation and control. Almost every large state, at some point, delegated tax collection to private contractors or local intermediaries. It was efficient. It reduced the immediate cost of building a direct system. But delegation always created a gap. The private collectors' interests were not the same as the state's interests. States that relied heavily on delegation often found their revenue unpredictable and their fiscal knowledge limited. States that invested in direct collection capacity generally gained more over the long term, even if the upfront investment was larger. The third pattern is the importance of predictability. A state that could forecast its revenue with reasonable accuracy could plan ahead. It could commit to long-term projects. It could borrow money by pledging future tax income. It could offer stable employment to administrators and soldiers. Predictable revenue was the foundation of everything that required long-term commitment. States without it were constantly reacting to immediate pressures. States with it could act in advance. The fourth pattern is the connection between fiscal capacity and political stability. States that collected revenue reliably and were seen using it for recognizable public purposes, like roads, security, courts, and public order, tended to maintain more stable relationships with their populations. People pay taxes more consistently when they believe the system is functioning and reasonably fair. When fiscal systems broke down through corruption, mismanagement, or severe inequality in enforcement, political stability often weakened alongside them. The fiscal system was not just a financial mechanism. It was a social relationship between the state and the people it governed. These patterns repeat across very different empires, periods, and geographies. They suggest that strong revenue systems are not simply a feature of powerful states. They are part of what makes states powerful in the first place. This logic did not disappear as states became more complex in later centuries. It found new expressions. In Japan, the Meiji government that came to power in the 1860s inherited a deeply fragmented fiscal system from the old feudal structure. Different domains had different tax rules. Revenue flowing to the central government was uneven and unpredictable. One of the first major reforms was the Land Tax Reform of 1873. It standardized land valuations across the country, converted the tax obligation to a fixed monetary payment, and directed the revenue to the central government rather than to local lords. Within a decade, the land tax was providing the majority of the new state's income. It was the fiscal foundation on which Japan's rapid industrialization was built. In Britain, the 18th century expansion of the customs and excise system became one of the most carefully studied examples of fiscal state building in European history. Adam Smith observed it closely in his own lifetime. The historian John Brewer later described it as the structural backbone of British state capacity, a professional, relatively well-organized revenue administration capable of collecting enough income to fund a scale of government activity that earlier states could not have sustained. Different tools, different centuries, different geographies, but the same underlying law. A state that organizes its revenue system carefully and maintains it consistently builds a kind of institutional endurance that other advantages cannot easily replace. What the long history of revenue systems suggests is something simple but easy to overlook. Political power is not just about having resources. It is about having organized systems to collect, manage, and deploy them reliably, year after year. The states that built lasting power were usually the states that built serious administrative machinery for revenue. They surveyed their territories. They counted their people. They recorded what was owned and what was owed. They trained officials to do this work consistently, not just once, but across generations. That machinery was not glamorous. It was slow to build and expensive to maintain, but it created something deeply valuable: predictability. A state that knows how much revenue it will collect next year can plan and commit in ways that a state without that knowledge simply cannot. Armies win battles. Diplomats negotiate agreements. But it is the tax official, the census surveyor, and the accounts administrator who make it possible to sustain either over time. The strongest financial foundation of political power has rarely been a single great resource or a single decisive victory. It has been a system, a dependable, well-organized method of turning economic activity into state capacity, working quietly in the background, year after year, without ceremony. If this kind of institutional history interests you, the practical, structural side of how states actually built and sustained power, there is much more on this channel worth exploring.